In a previous video titled The Biggest Mistake Beginners Make When Buying an Audio Interface, I talked about the importance of choosing an audio interface that will provide enough microphone inputs based on the music or content you wish to record. In that video, I recommend an interface with at least 2 mic inputs for almost everyone, even if they think they will only use one of those inputs at the beginning. Then I go on to recommend an interface with at least 8 microphone inputs for those who plan to record a band with a drum kit. This was one of the most popular videos on the Audio University channel, and many have found it helpful, but I've seen a lot of comments on that video, all of which pose the same question. Why not just use a mixer instead of an interface with multiple inputs? That's the question I want to answer in this video. So let's start by understanding the solution these commenters are putting forward, and then I'll show you why that is only a partial solution to the problem. If you want to record multiple microphones at the same time, the best solution is to use an interface with a separate input for each microphone. As you'll see in a moment, there's a big advantage of doing it this way. However, if you're trying to save money, you could potentially buy an interface with only one input and then route multiple microphones to that same input using a mixer. Here's what that would look like. Multiple microphones can be connected to an analog mixer. The mixer can sum those signals into one output, and then the output of the mixer can be connected to the input of an audio interface to be recorded into a single track within the DAW. This would work as a solution should you need to simultaneously record more microphones than you have inputs on your interface. In fact, my bandmates and I used this technique to record 7 microphones using only a 4-channel audio interface and a 4-channel mixer. And it worked, but not without presenting a few problems. I'm not going to say that this is a bad idea because it's actually a very resourceful idea, and I learned a lot by doing it this way. So to all of you commenters who left this suggestion, nice work, I like the way you think. However, for the beginners out there watching this, I want to make sure that you understand the key difference between recording with a mixer in this way versus using an interface with a separate input for each microphone. Back in the earlier days of recording, engineers would run their studios in a very similar fashion to this diagram. The main difference being that instead of an audio interface, a tape machine was used. In the times before multitrack tape, all of the signals would need to be summed into one signal and recorded to that tape machine as the final mix. With this setup, the individual microphones could not be independently controlled after being mixed together, so that meant the mixing had to be done before pressing the record button. In other words, once the signals were summed, the engineer would no longer have the ability to make changes to an individual element as they could when the signals were still isolated in the mixer. The signals were mixed separately as they flowed through the mixer and then summed together to the tape machine. So no mixing could be done after that summing, or at least very little mixing could be done. When multitrack tape was created, engineers could then record some microphones to channel 1, other microphones to channel 2, others to channel 3, and so on. And even in the days of 4-track tape, they still shared tracks between multiple instruments. That could mean sharing tracks at the point of the initial recording, or recording instruments to separate tracks at first, and then summing multiple tracks together to save space throughout the process. There's a really cool video that illustrates this technique as used on the Sgt. Pepper's album by the Beatles. I'll leave a link to that video in the description below. Eventually, engineers started using 24-track tape, and thereafter DAW sessions, which could facilitate hundreds of tracks. And these developments led engineers to record each microphone to a separate track rather than summing multiple microphones to the same track. The reason they did this ties us back into the main point of this video. When we connect each microphone to its own track on the tape machine, or to its own input on an audio interface, we can keep the microphone signals separated even after recording. When we sum the signals together with a mixer and record them to one track, we lose the independent control of each signal. In the DAW, this would be the difference between seeing only one waveform and seeing a separate waveform for each microphone. When we preserve the isolation between microphones by using separate tracks, we open up the possibility of making changes to each individual microphone signal later on during the mixing phase. Picture this. When my bandmates and I recorded the drums through a mixer and into a single input on our audio interface, we could use EQ and compression on the drum track as a whole, but we were unable to affect the kick drums separate from the snare drum or cymbals. However, if we had connected each drum mic to its own interface input and routed each input to a separate track in the DAW, we could have used different EQ, gate, compression, and reverb settings for each component of the drums, giving us a lot more control over the sound. Any EQ we wanted to apply to only the kick drum, for example, had to be done in the mixer beforehand. The same went for the snare and the overhead mics. Once these signals were summed into one track in the DAW, they were much harder to mix individually, and our mixer didn't even have a compressor on each channel, so individual compression wasn't an option. There is something to be said about making decisions early on in the recording process, rather than waiting until the mixing phase. And like I said before, you can learn a lot by placing obstacles in your way and working around them. However, using a mixer and a one-channel interface will not give you the same outcome as using an interface with more inputs. And I hope this video has helped to make that more clear. I expect a lot of the people commenting on the previous video already knew that, but I thought it would be worth explaining in this video for those of you who didn't know. In the next video that's on your screen now, we'll look into other ways mixers can be helpful in a studio, so you can decide if you need one or not. I'll see you there.